Hello and welcome to the Leaders Council podcast, the podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. You join us on a sunny day here in the capital in a week where we're not quite sure whether a global pandemic or Russian interference poses a greater threat to the country. I'm sure time will tell, of course, on that one. My name is Scott Challoner, the host of the programme today, and in each episode I aim to bring together two new unique perspectives on leadership. I'm delighted to be joined first and foremost on the programme today by Colonel Michael Kingscote, the founder of Outposts, a residential centre providing educational outdoor activities for schools and youth, corporate special interest and family groups. Michael, very warm welcome to you today and thank you ever so much for joining us.
Good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael. Real pleasure having you. Now, the purpose of this discussion is to establish your take on leadership first and foremost. So if we begin by considering that word leader in a little bit more detail, I'm interested to understand what that word means to you and what you feel the role of a leader is.
Well, I think simply it's the ability to inspire people to do things that they would not necessarily do of their own volition. That was how I would sum up the word leadership.
And considering your sort of own personal leadership style, how would you describe that?
Well, I always try to achieve the highest standards. That is right there. But I think that's that possibly has a military background to it. Also, to be a good leader, I think you have to have the highest standards of your own personal discipline and behaviour. I definitely have a sense of humour, and I try and maintain a sense of humility too. And also, the world has changed considerably in the time that I've been practicing leadership, which is now 50 years. And most importantly is to maintain an aura of classlessness. Everybody has got something to offer, and it's the ability to draw out from people that little gem that they may have in their mind that actually makes a good leader. One has to have respect and respect for everybody. And I think that those would be the four sort of métiers that I would subscribe to.
And thinking of that military background that you have as well there, Michael, would you say there are any elements of leadership from that career that you've been able to sort of transfer into the business world?
I think all of them. The interesting thing is when you transfer from being a military man into the civilian world, there is a watershed that you have to deal with, and that is that it's not a case of giving instructions. And I've always subscribed to never asking somebody to do something that I either haven't done myself or I could do myself. And I think that's really important. But the ability to understand what people are thinking and to listen to what people are thinking, much more so now in operating a civilian business, is very important indeed. Still, those four tenets that I talked about at the beginning, they very much form the background of what I'm doing now and the way I deal with people, and it's worked so far.
And one of the biggest challenges for today's leaders, I think it's fair to say, has been the emergence of the ongoing COVID-19 situation and how that has impacted everybody. In your industry, Michael, just how difficult has it been adapting to the challenges of this new reality that we're all facing?
Well, Scott, in simple terms, we have had no business on site here on our centre here since November last year. That gives you an idea of the shock that it's impacted upon us. When the lockdown was imposed in March, I freely admit that I personally, and I'm sure all of the staff that I have that work for us who are all furloughed, and they comprise an office of about 7 and about 60 others who are employed freelance, and who rely on us for income during the summer. There was a moment where we were stunned by what had happened, and it took a moment to consolidate and think through and logically work out a way ahead. Now, one could have folded one's tent and left the field, if you understand what I mean. But no, that's not in my makeup. And certainly, talking to everybody, communication was absolutely vital. I talk to all of our staff every day on Zoom, just to keep in touch to find out what they were doing, and also keeping in touch with our freelancers to let them know that we were still here. Sadly, we were not in a position to help the freelancers financially, but at least they know that we're still around. And since then, which is twice since then, I've been updating them as to where we're going. And we've had to remodel considerably. So I think, Scott, possibly patience and flexibility came straight through on that. Yeah, that's about what I'd say, yeah.
And I can imagine that the mental health and well-being of those people has been at the forefront of the mind throughout this as well, because people do ultimately react to different circumstances differently, let alone a crisis of this magnitude. And so where some might sort of be a little bit more sort of relaxed about carrying on under new sort of procedures and being furloughed, for others, they might just need that little bit more reassurance. And as a leader, it's about being sensitive to those needs as well.
Most certainly. And you can't be in everybody's house and you can't be in everybody's brain. So what I've tried to do is to talk to people regularly, both publicly on Zoom and privately on the phone, and listen to what they've got to say. Those who have got children who have not been able to go to school have been impacted even more so. And more often than not, they haven't got a house where they can tuck themselves away in a room and work privately. They've probably had to homeschool their children. Their husbands have been at home as well, and they've had to work somewhere. It's been quite an interesting process. You find out an awful lot about your staff. You also find out an awful lot about yourself. And that, again, comes back to, I think, patience and respect for them and understanding as to what they're going through.
And what things would you say that you have learned as you've adapted to this sort of new situation and about yourself and those around you? I can imagine it's really galvanized you in a way.
Yeah, well, I think the principal thing has been to take one's time, not be hasty. It's very, very easy to react very quickly, and the world it likes quick reactions, and as you know well, I prefer to think things through, and I really have had to think things through, because an inopportune remark or a careless email saying something that is not going to happen or having to change subsequently does not do any good. And I think one characteristic of leadership, which I've held up in addition to the four that I mentioned at the beginning, is consistency. One has to be consistent. You can't keep flip-flopping, because if you do, people will lose confidence in you.
Exactly right. It takes a great deal of leadership and decisiveness, proactivity, most importantly, having sort of plans in place, but also the ability to be reactive as well and adjust to changing guidelines and changing circumstances. On that last point, changing guidelines, changing circumstances, much, of course, has been made of the leadership from Westminster throughout the pandemic situation thus far. Have you been satisfied throughout that you've sort of known exactly what's been expected of you? The guidelines are clear, the support is there, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
As a person who's studied history and conflicts and situations, most campaigns are close-run things, and I would think that anybody in the position of our masters in Westminster have been under huge pressure. One doesn't really know what they're going through. One doesn't really know the background. One only sees what one sees, whether it be on television or in the papers. I haven't got great communications to what's going on behind the scenes. I think that there has been a degree of mixed messages, but that is the way things are. One only got to cast one's mind back to the financial crisis and obviously the two conflicts in the Middle East and, of course, the Falklands, where things were quite a close-run thing, and at the end one came through. And it's very easy with hindsight to criticize, but I don't think that anybody could have done a great deal better than the organisation that's at Westminster at the moment, because of the unknowns and the conflicting information that's coming in. Possibly, and it may have been simpler 20, 30 years ago when there weren't quite so many sources of information. And now there are. And when I'm talking to people about leadership and getting the best intelligence, which is always vital, it always comes down to a balance. You have to run with a course of action and justify why you're running with that course of action. And if it doesn't work, you change it. So I think to answer your question, all these things are closer on things gone.
I think that's absolutely right. I understand exactly where you're coming from that point of view. And we know that over the course of the next 12 to 18 months or however longer it takes for COVID-19 to no longer become an issue, that we're going to have to adjust to a new normal way of living. So if we think about the challenges that new normal is going to bring, what is next for you, Michael, and for the Outposts organisation, and what do you really hope to achieve during this time?
Straight to the heart. Thank you. Okay, well, the first thing is overseas operations. I am cancelling those now completely for a variety of reasons. First, there's huge uncertainty. We concentrate on Africa, and nothing is very stable there. And I've sadly had to stand down my suppliers over there. Also, we've discovered that there are various government regulations, EU and government regulations, which mitigate against travel overseas. So that's the first thing, and I'm going to concentrate now on developing what we can in the United Kingdom. We have seen 5 of our big 6 corporate plans, very well-known household names, cancelled for this year. But one of them said, which I think is showing confidence, said, keep the deposit, we'll come back next year. And I think I'm going to concentrate on developing the leadership programs we have here on site for corporate people. I think there will be a demand for that. As you well know, some of the big companies have stopped recruiting and there have been many redundancies. But downstream, if the companies are going to survive, they're going to have to start recruiting and training. And that is what I'm going to concentrate on, certainly for 2021. And the rest is a bit of a dim beacon on the horizon.
It is really only speculation at the moment, isn't it, of what might come in the future. And considering the fact that it's probably much better to actually wait till the time comes and then reassess exactly what has happened and where we need to go from there. I think it would be wonderful, Michael, to catch up with you and have you back on the show with us in a few months' time just to see where we are at that point, when hopefully there will be a little bit more positive news to share.
Well, that's very kind. I hope I'm still here.
I certainly hope so as well, Michael, for sure. It's been a real pleasure having you join us on the programme today. And most importantly, until we do touch base again, hopefully in future, please do take care and stay safe with all still going on, because we are most certainly not out of the woods yet.
No, we're not. No. Thank you so much, Scott.
I was speaking today to Colonel Michael Kingscote, founder of Outposts. And coming up next on the programme today, I'll be handing over to Matthew O'Neill for his exclusive interview with former Education Secretary Lord Blunkett. Lord Blunkett is today an active member of the House of Lords, chairman of the Leaders' Council of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of course a prominent former Labour MP and Secretary of State. I hope that you all enjoy listening just as much as Matthew relished the opportunity to speak with Lord Blunkett, and all of that is of course coming up next.
Lord Blunkett, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you.
Well, of course, nothing is being said at the moment other than COVID-19, which we must touch on. What would your message be to small businesses who are trying to keep going?
Well, I think the last ones standing will be the ones that thrive when we get back to some sort of normality. So it's have confidence and courage. Obviously take advantage as far as you can of the government help. I think that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has gone about as far as you could have expected in the circumstances. There are obviously small businesses that fall between the cracks. Those who don't have defined premises can't benefit from the business rate waiver, have not really been able to demonstrate that they can adhere to the PAYE for furloughing staff, and of course whether they can receive the grant, 10,000 or 25,000. All of those who can are obviously able at least to benefit from that for the time being and look to the future. But I think the second thing to say, and they don't need me to tell them this as a politician who did once do a business studies qualification, which is that it will be a different world, and being able to think about how that world will look in a year's time and be creative about it and learn from not just what's happening to you at this moment in time, but to others around you and the sector that you're working in, that will be really important.
Do you feel that the long-term effects of the COVID-19 outbreak will in some ways be positive for British industry?
Well, only in the sense that people are having to be creative, they're having to adjust and innovate. Therefore, they're thinking about more productive, if you like, greater productivity ways of delivering the same service or delivering the same products. And in that sense, I think we'll have temporarily at least very much higher unemployment than we've become used to, but we'll probably have a burst of productivity, which will help with the recovery. Whether it will help with the inequity of the way in which our economy is imbalanced, both between services and productivity and the production of goods and services, I'm not sure. What we will need to try and do is to ensure that the geographic imbalance that exists is, as far as humanly possible, is dealt with by both the entrepreneurship and innovation from the bottom up and targeted government help, which will still be needed. And we are now in the throes of the kind of borrowing that we saw back in 2008 to save the banking and economic system. We're having to do that to save the whole of our productive business and commerce, and I think that will have to be sustained for some time.
Do you feel that people will take a second look at global supply chains in the wake of this outbreak?
I think there's going to be much more creative ways of using local supply and linking up inside sectors much more effectively. And I hope that the Leaders' Council will be able to play a part in that, in the sense that people who have something in common, a synergy in terms of what they're delivering, whether it's a service or whether it's manufacturing or whatever, will be able to see that there's a good outcome from knowing the sector better, linking with people, not just geographically, locally, but those in this country who may not have been on the radar in terms of what they produced for the supply chain. And of course, ensuring, because there's quite a lot of fraud going on as we speak with people getting into cyber attacks, that they'll also take account of going into the cyber security side effectively as well. The more we are online, the more people who are working from home, the more vulnerable those businesses and their supply chain become. And that's something to think about as well.
How important is strong leadership at the moment?
Well, I actually think that it's brought to the fore leadership in a whole range of areas, from obviously government itself, and there's been ups and downs with the Prime Minister's severe illness, but all the way through the public and private sector, people have, to use the jargon, stepped up, and they've shown local, regional, national level the kind of leadership that Britain historically was very good at. Regrettably, we've not seen the same on the international scene for all kinds of reasons, but maybe we will in future. So I think out of this will come experience of people who have seen an opportunity to do good, as well as seen an opportunity to provide a good service or goods, including, for instance, shortages for the health and social care system, the food chain and the like. But also, I think in terms of seeing the synergy between the private and the voluntary sector and using people's commitment to each other in a very positive way. I'm not sentimental about this. Things will revert. But actually, I think there's a kind of moment of moral judgment of people feeling that they've got a role to play outside the immediate survival that they're engaged in. And if we can hang on to a little bit of that social responsibility, that will be a very positive outcome.
Absolutely. Now, what's your broad view of how the government is responding to this? Are you broadly supportive of their measures?
Well, it may surprise people to hear that I have been very supportive. Of course, there's been legitimate criticisms about the speed of response on protective equipment and on issues relating to testing. But my own view is very similar to the challenge that was made to the Prime Minister of Italy when people said, why didn't you close Italy down faster? And he said, a fortnight before we did it, I would have been considered to be a madman and nobody would have agreed to do it if I'd tried to move too quickly. And I think that's something that we need to reflect on here in the UK. We may have seen the signals elsewhere across the world and taken them more seriously at the time. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but as someone who's had his life in the opposite political party to the present government, I think that with some hiccups and mistakes, they've not done a bad job in what has been incredibly difficult circumstances.
And you're absolutely right. In a liberal democracy that we live in, it's very difficult for people to swallow orders given to them from government.
Well, the UK and the US, and to some extent the Scandinavian countries, have a very different history and therefore interest in maintaining the freedom to decide and the persuasion and consent that's required. Those countries that have experienced one way or another totalitarianism over the last century have a slightly different way of coming at this. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think that that's why getting the balance right of getting people to go along with what you want them to do in their interests as well as the nation as a whole is a sensible, proportional balance. And I think we now need to adjust to the coming out of the crisis gradually, readjusting to recovery in the same way.
Now, something you've mentioned recently on this balance is the police overreach in the enforcement of the COVID-19 structures that have been put in place. What have they done right, and where have they gone too far?
Well, I think that they were interpreting what was not necessarily as clear advice as it might have been for all kinds of reasons, because people were feeling their way. I think what's come out of it has been a demonstration by local police services in some parts of the country that they could get people to do what was needed without the heavy hand of drones overhead or people being told that they shouldn't be walking in the street, because this was all about self-isolation, not incarceration. It was about getting people not to pass the infection on to each other and therefore to provide distance rather than to make our lives a misery. Those police services that adopted that policing by consent and chivying people along did really well. Those who went over the top, I think, soon got a very substantial pushback. And one of the strengths of our democracy is that you could have that debate. People could say, I'm terribly sorry, we think the police force in our area has gone over the top. And that in itself is a constraint and a readjustment. That's another strength of living in a country where you can have opinions and express them without actually being thought to be a fool.
Now, of course, the government has faced criticism that they were slow to react, and Boris Johnson wasn't present at the early COVID-19 COBRA meetings. Now, Number 10 has claimed that this is normal practice. The health secretary often chairs COBRA meetings related to health. Does this tally with your experience as a Secretary of State, or would you have expected the PM to be more hands-on during the initial stages?
I think different prime ministers do have a very different style. And Boris's style, which I think will now be considerably adjusted, was very swashbuckling. In some senses, delegating is a good thing, as every leader of every business or public service knows. Those who try to pull too much into themselves end up with a massive bottleneck, great failure of trust, and the inability of people to show what they're worth and to demonstrate their capability. So I'd be very wary of jumping in and saying he was wrong to delegate the essential COBRA meetings. What I was surprised about was that he didn't chair the first couple, because
Mm-hmm.
My experience with Tony Blair for the 8 years I was in cabinet was that Tony was a great delegator, but he would get a grip to begin with, watch what the difficulties were, and then give people direction and confidence to be able to get on with it. So looking back, I think Boris himself probably thinks, God, I wish I'd spotted the signals from elsewhere in the world more rapidly, and I'd just been there. However, this also raises another issue. All of us in positions of leadership need good teams around us.
Mm-hmm.
I think after this is over, he will be assessing those who really did step up and those who demonstrated their inadequacy. I think we'll probably end up in a year's time with a much stronger cabinet than we have today.
Well, absolutely. And of course, we've seen a significant drop in the visibility of certain special advisors like Dominic Cummings during this entire period. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out.
It's certainly readjusted the role of those behind the scenes with those who should be taking the decisions, having received advice. Obviously, there's been a complete transformation in the profile of experts, if I might use that term, who'd previously been denigrated.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists, medics, people with behavioral science understanding. My only criticism was, were we getting wide enough advice? Were we narrowing it too much to a couple of key centres in London? But that's because I've always been adverse to everything being London-centric. I think there's great expertise, wisdom, experience out in the sticks, and we should use it.
Rightly so. Now, was pandemic planning part of your time as a minister, particularly perhaps when you were Home Secretary?
Well, it was, but it was on the back of risk arising out of counter-terrorism measures.
Right.
I was the Home Secretary for 3 months when the attack took place in September 2001 on the World Trade Center and beyond. We did an enormous amount of scenario planning, both desktop and real. On the back of that, it was very heavily orientated to future developing terrorism risk. I certainly got involved with talking about pandemics. I remember being at a seminar in Edinburgh where the university there had done a lot of work itself on the issue of pandemics. And of course, we saw SARS and other things emerging. I think people criticized the government for not picking up the report from 2015, 5 years ago. I think that what happens is human nature kicks in. You deal with what you're immediately faced with. You can sponsor reports, and this is true of business planning, of course, as well, and scenario planning for what business continuity will look like, recovery plans for business, what will happen if there's a cyber attack, what happens if there's an energy shutdown. These kind of things you can look at, but you're immediately turning your eyes to what's in front of you. And had we picked up a bit more on the danger from Ebola and SARS and what have you in the past, then we might have said, what if something hits us in the developed nations that we don't have a vaccine for, that we can't immediately whisk up protective materials or equipment, or for that matter, medicines that help with recovery, all of which we now see are a danger. I think this will make an enormous difference to the planning for the years ahead. I hope it will be widened so that we don't just look at what's happened, but very rarely do you see something exactly repeat itself. Some of the circumstances will be, but others won't. So that's why I've put emphasis in what I talk about on looking at the other virus, the cyber attack scenario, which could be just as dangerous in a world of just-in-time provision. One of the miracles of the modern developed world, except for the very poor, has been the distribution of food. A lot of it on computerized, technologically advanced systems. If that were to come down, we'd be in real trouble. So I think we need to think those sort of scenarios as well.
So have a full plan across both sectors, biological warfare, pandemics, and cyber warfare.
Yes, and to do so on different levels. I think again, thinking global but acting local, we need a lot more to think about what would happen if something took shape that actually broke down those national and global chains and how we would cope. And without, obviously, we've got enough fear and anxiety to last a lifetime. Without creating even more anxiety, we can think about those things for the future in a more rational way, I think.
Now, aside from the physical threat of the virus, one of the things that people are vastly worried about is the effect on the economy, not just national economy, but also the world economy. Now, it has been said by certain parties, and I'd like to garner your thoughts on this. Is there a danger of the effects of the lockdown being even worse than those of the virus?
Were it be prolonged, I fear that balance would tip the other way. It is about proportionality. It is about balance. It's the wisdom of Solomon, really, to get the moment right when you start to move and then to move quickly. There's no doubt whatsoever that we are stocking up, not just on the economic and employment front, which will be devastating enough, but on the health and social well-being front, enormous challenges, and they will need careful handling because there's a lot of people whose lives, for a variety of reasons, are at risk in the future on a scale that we've been dealing with over the immediate handling of the pandemic, concentrating really hard on those affected by COVID-19, those sadly who have died or been seriously incapacitated. That will roll over into the economic, the social, the mental health and cultural well-being of the nation, and that will need all of us to pull together as well.
Absolutely. Now, do you believe the government's doing enough for business?
I think that the speed of reaction once the scale of the pandemic was clear was very good. I've praised Rishi Sunak for his action. Remember, a chancellor who only just come into office was planning to deliver the budget in the middle of March and has had at least three equivalent budgets since. I think he's handled it very well. Understandably worried now about what we're doing to our economy. The level of borrowing is sustainable because of low interest rates, but it reaches a point, of course, where it tips over so that you can't then do the kind of structural investment requirements that the government were laying out before and in the March budget. And those will have their consequences as well as a planned payback over many years. I think we've learned something over the last few months. We needed to take immediate action. We don't want another round of austerity equivalent from 2010 through to 2019. I don't think the nation, on the back of what's happened and the challenges we have, could take that. And therefore, we need a different plan, economic plan, over a much longer period, just as we did from the Second World War all the way through to 2002, when the final American loans were paid off.
Now, of course, one thing that's on everyone's lips, how much longer do you believe that the lockdown can go on for?
I believe that we need to be substantially back in action as an economy in June. This obviously is led in terms of places where people would meet in large numbers, having to adjust to the fact that it will be longer for them. And sadly, that will involve business closures. It's why the Chancellor extended the furlough scheme to the end of June. Mm-hmm. But unless we get things moving in June, I think we'll run into the summer where all kinds of services and industries will have a chain reaction effect. And what happens with one will then have a major impact on another. And then you get the skittle effect where things get knocked down that you hadn't perceived were going to be affected. So I very much, if I were in government, and I always think of things in that context, what would I do if I were in government? I would be on the side from the second week in May, on the side of the hawks in terms of saying we've got to start moving, and we've got to do so with the collaboration and cooperation of the public who have got the message, who did behave, who responded magnificently. Let's try and get back, perhaps, doing things differently for a time, but substantially getting back to business as usual. And unless we do that, then those areas that can't and wouldn't expect to be back in action immediately get pushed further into the middle of the year and the autumn, and then they become unsustainable.
Now, of course, one of the other major developments we've had recently are the changes in the Labour Party. So if we could just speak on the Labour Party for a while. This might sound like an obvious question, but how does Sir Keir differ from Mr. Corbyn?
Well, I'm biased because I believe the Labour Party has come out of 4.5 years of a black hole of a nightmare, where it neither represented a credible opposition nor an electable government, and the combination was to let those who supported the Labour Party and needed some of its policies let them down very badly. Sir Keir Starmer both is a highly intelligent, professional lawyer who, as Director of Public Prosecutions, led the service well, had to take difficult decisions at a time of austerity, understands the world beyond Labour members, but has been able to do business with those who originally supported Jeremy Corbyn and was able to command support from them. His creation of a balanced shadow ministerial team has been very encouraging. I supported Lisa Nandy, who he's made Shadow Foreign Secretary, because I thought she understood the north of England and the disaffected former Labour voters. But I believe that Sir Keir has taken on board those who have something really sensible to offer, and I believe he will be both a great leader of the opposition. More importantly, he will then present himself as a credible alternative Prime Minister. And all governments need an alternative government at their shoulder. It was true of us from 97, and it took the Conservatives some time to recover and to get to that position, but they did, and the Labour Party will, and that's crucial for our democracy. All of us need to understand and appreciate that a living, breathing, functioning democracy requires a credible, confident, and in many ways supportable opposition, as well as a government that we clearly want to do well, because none of us want, as we didn't with the COVID crisis, none of us want the government to fail. We want to see our economy recover. We want our social well-being to be taken into account. We want to overcome deep-seated inequality and poverty, and we want to do it with enterprise and entrepreneurship and business playing their role, and that is about leadership nationally, locally, in the private and the public sector, people with ideas, with confidence, with the ability to pull teams around them, above all, to have some idea of what it is they want to achieve and a very good idea as to how to achieve it.
Now, of course, one of the biggest problems Sir Keir is facing will be tackling the party's anti-Semitism problem. There has been a recent internal report that has been quite damning. What's your response to that report, and what does Sir Keir need to do in response?
Well, there are two reports. One which is being produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which he will, and has already indicated, will implement in full. The second was a leaked report put together by the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, 800 pages of private interchanges on social media, which he has, Keir Starmer, set up an investigation to identify who did it, who leaked it, what the content was, does it have any salience and lessons for us, and where necessary, action will be taken. So I hope that as he moved very quickly to reassure the Jewish community, so he will be able to take the necessary steps to back up that reassurance with the kind of actions that says that this was a blight on a historic great political party that all of us were ashamed of. We've been able to put that behind us and to move on to facing the future with confidence.
What's the one key thing that Sakir needs to do to restore Labour as an election-winning party?
I think Sir Keir Starmer's major challenge is to convince sceptical voters that Labour has not only reverted to a party that they can support because they can see it acting, developing, presenting as a credible alternative government, but also that the lessons have been learned from the fiasco from 2015 onwards. In other words, there have to be very clear signals of substantial change, not just the right words, not just reassurance that we're not going back to some of the crazier policies, but actually that we've understood why the electorate rejected those policies so substantially in December 2019. If people get that message, they'll understand that the Labour Party has changed, as it did in the 1980s and early 90s, to become the electable government with the greatest majority in historic majority, even greater than 1945, which I was privileged to be able to take advantage of in 1997 when I joined the cabinet.
Now, I know what your answer is going to be to this question, but indulge me. Do you think Sakir has what it takes to be PM?
Yes, I do. I think he has the background, he has the experience, he has the professionalism, he has the forensic mindset, and he has the confidence to have put a team around him which will ensure that it will work. And those elements are true of all leaders. Ideas, the ability to build a team, to have confidence in that team, and to be able to demonstrate leadership in practice, sometimes at the most difficult times. And, you know, the Leaders' Council, those sharing their thoughts with the kind of thing that we're doing now with a podcast, but also joining us in linking up in that network of people who can support and help each other and learn from each other. That is what needs to be done in politics as it needs to be done in business. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew.
Well, thank you for coming on the program. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all those listening in what has been a nightmare scenario. Good luck for the future. Have courage, have confidence, and yes, listen to those who know more about business than I ever will.
Thank you, Lord Plunkett.
Thank you.
This has been the Leaders' Council podcast. Thank you for celebrating excellence in leadership with us. I've been your host, Scott Challoner. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast. The views expressed within the podcast do not reflect the views of the Leaders' Council of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, its parent company or subsidiaries, members of staff, or other guests of any other person therein associated.